So this episode is called First Con-Tact, which is good pun, solid pun. But let me just say this. There's an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called First Contact. There's a movie called Star Trek First Contact. There's an episode of Star Trek Lower Decks called Second Contact. There's another episode of Star Trek Lower Decks called First Contact. And now we have First Contact. Are you trying to make Trekkies go crazy? Because this is how you make Trekkies go crazy. Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well because it is time for me to review yet another episode of Star Trek Prodigy as per usual. This time Season 1, Episode 7, as I already said, First Contact. Which again, solid pun, but man, they're doubling up on these titles quite a lot lately. I mean, once you've done over, 800 episodes of Star Trek, I kind of get it, but it's just kind of funny how there's been repeat titles a lot lately in Star Trek. But regardless, going into this episode review, as per usual, I'll do my spoiler-free thoughts, and then I'll get into my spoiler-filled and sort of episode breakdown in just a minute. But staying spoiler-free up front, I will say I enjoyed this episode overall for quite a few reasons. The first of which is this episode gives us a little bit more of a backstory around the character of Dal, and I feel like that has been much needed. As I've kind of repeated a few times over the past few episode reviews, Dal has been a little bit frustrating because I feel like his character has been moving forward, but he still is kind of in that place where he's still that kind of arrogant teenager, which understandable for the character. It's a good arc to take him on, but it does feel like he stalled out a little bit there. And so this episode, by giving us his backstory and also having a character from that backstory sort of highlighting who Dal used to be, we can kind of get a better sense of how much Dal has evolved over the course of just the past few episodes of this season. And I think that really comes out in a few really strong moments throughout the latter half of the episode. And I think that's a lot of fun. And then there's also a couple other bits in this episode that, after the big reveal at the end of last episode that Chakotay was the captain of the Protostar before this, there's a little bit more of evolving of that mystery here that is not particularly shocking. It kind of goes along with what I think a few of us already thought and kind of were thinking in terms of the backstory of the mystery of this, but it does start to progress that a little bit forward nicely, and I do have a couple interesting thoughts and tidbits that I'll sort of put in the spoiler-filled section on that. That all being said, I do have to have one final asterisk on my sort of spoiler-free thoughts here, and I feel frustrated because this is always my case with this show so far, is that I really like the episode, and then there's always an asterisk that just bugs me. And this week, there are a few things sort of done in terms of the world building, both within this show itself and some things that's already established, as well as the larger Star Trek universe as a whole, that I feel like kind of fall apart upon closer inspection. And I'll talk about it a little bit more when we get into the spoiler stuff, but it just frustrates me because there's just this this show seems to have such an intricate idea of its mythology, especially going back to the Diviner and some clear time travel stuff going on, and it's very, very thoughtfully and carefully done, so that when there's these moments where it starts to kind of have a little bit of conveniences show up and sort of characters appearing just randomly because they're there for the plot, as well as just hints towards things that characters should or shouldn't know, specifically around, should Dal know who the Federation was, considering who raised him, as we learn in this episode. It just gets a little bit frustrating, and it can be explained away, and I know the show is for kids, so, again, maybe I'm just a Trekkie who's overthinking it, but just sitting here being like, that's a little bit confusing, and a little bit sort of makes my brain kind of have to do a couple extra steps to make it work in my mind, and it just frustrates me a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that in the spoiler-filled section, but that is my biggest sort of asterisk here. But overall, I think this is a strong episode, again, pushing forward Dal, which has been much needed for his character over the past few episodes, and so I think this is a really strong, necessary episode. It also, too, it gave us a little bit of connecting, again, as this show has been doing, bringing up ideas of, the Prime Directive and sort of these staples of Star Trek lore and introducing them to a new generation through this show, which I think was another strong concept of this episode. So yeah, overall, I liked it. A few caveats here and there, but we'll get into that in spoilers in just a second. Okay, so getting into spoilers here, we have the opening of the episode where the crew is going around, sort of teleporting around a pie, which is adorable, and teaching the crew how a teleporter works, and again, also the audience and kids who may be new to Star Trek what a teleporter is, and I thought that was absolutely adorable. We also get that hologram Janeway is learning a little bit more about the mystery. Again, we'll sort of nudge that forward in just a second later on in the episode, but sort of a reminder that that is going on, and Chakotay being character from Star Trek Voyager, who we're all excited to see come back here, playing into that a little bit. Not too much going on new there. But then we get into the sort of main plot of the episode, and this is where I'll talk about my sort of hesitations that I was speaking about in my spoiler-free section, because here we have Dahl encounter his old partner and friend in crime, Damon Nandi, who is a female Ferengi, which is cool to see. I always love when the Ferengi pop up, especially a female Ferengi, because we haven't gotten to see many of those. I'm surprised that she's clothed. I mean, obviously, you don't want to have a not clothed Ferengi in a kid show, but it just was like, there must be an interesting backstory with this female Ferengi, I'm pretty sure. But the thing that gets me, and this is part one of my sort of issues going on here, was last episode we had established that the Protostar had zipped across like half the galaxy, apparently. Like they established that they had went very, very far. So it weirds me out that the first ship that they encounter just happens to be someone that Dahl intimately knows and is of a species that we have already encountered before within Star Trek. It just felt very, very convenient to me, especially after you had already established that the ship had just zoomed across the galaxy to, presumably, I think they mentioned that they were in the Gamma Quadrant. So what are the chances of this being the case here? It just felt really convenient. And again, you can make it work if you say, like, in between last episode and this episode, they had zoomed back to the Delta Quadrant for some reason. But why would they have done that? Because they know the Diviner's looking for them, so why would they go back in that direction? Also, it's sort of, like, weird that you have to assume that that happens off camera. So that was particularly frustrating. And then the next thing that we learn is Dahl beams over to the ship that he used to live on, and we get a couple good moments with like Gwen being like, oh, this is the place that you used to look out of the window of dreams, that sort of thing. I like that sort of establishing of his backstory and the fact that Gwen does know a little bit about Dahl, and then maybe his past wasn't as perfect as he made it out to be. I enjoyed that. But then we get the Ferengi woman mention that she knows that the ship is Federation, because she says, oh, you're working with the Federation? Which, again, we had already established that Dahl didn't know who the Federation was. So if he was living with this Ferengi, wouldn't he then have known what the Federation was? Wouldn't he have been aware of it, especially if she was, especially if she's a Ferengi from the Alpha Quadrant who presumably would have encountered the Federation? It just feels like there's pieces of world building there that are missing for me. And again, it's small potatoes because, like, maybe she just never mentioned the Federation before. But again, I would have liked a moment where Dahl's like, you know what the Federation is? Because they made such a big deal of him not knowing that. So it's just like small pieces of this world building that I'm like, you're missing something here. And it just frustrated me, especially because everything else in the mythology seems to be so, like the timelines and stuff that they're clearly playing with, again, going to that time travel stuff, is so intentionally placed that these small misses just frustrate me. And maybe that's just me as an older Trekkie, and this is made for kids, and I'm just supposed to ignore and gloss over that stuff. But the show is so detail-oriented elsewhere that I don't really want to give the show a pass when it makes these bigger mistakes, if that makes any particular sense to anybody. But again, maybe it's a nitpick, maybe it's just me, maybe you think differently. That's just my thoughts on it. That's my biggest nitpick with the episode, because the rest of this was actually very, very good, because we basically get this concept where Damon Nandi wants to go down to this planet that has never encountered a starfaring ship before and sort of sell a like plate that she has and say it's like some big mystical thing in order to get these crystals that she's looking for, as well as get some substance that they need that the Protostar has in order to fuel her cloaking device. So I thought that was very cool. And then we get Hologram Janeway kind of coming in and explaining the Prime Directive. We don't mess with races that haven't encountered the Federation before without being very intentional about it, setting up that like really important piece of Star Trek lore. But I like that the characters kind of ignore her and go down anyways and encounter this really cool, like, Dune-like planet where they speak with sound. And I like that Gwen, the communications officer, was actually the one to figure it out. Again, showing her skill in developing her. Thought that was absolutely wonderful, sort of, like, small background building of her character, even though she wasn't the center focus here. And I love this idea that this was a species that sort of an energy being that looked really, really beautiful, that was essentially just able to morph things with sound. Just a cool, very Star Trek alien concept was absolutely wonderful. They go down and they encounter and they find all the crystals, and they realize that the crystals are very important to them being able to have this power and to be able to communicate. And Damon Nandi is just trying to sell this plate. Again, sort of echoes of this sort of colonialization idea of like, oh, we're selling, land for beads because, indigenous people didn't have a concept of land ownership. That sort of like, idea going on here, and sort of that idea of colonialization that's always been kind of discussed discussed and dissected and interrogated within Star Trek as a whole. So I thought that that was sort of a cool idea being brought up here. And then Dahl essentially challenging Damon when she steals some of the crystals, sort of breaking things down. And I love the clever concept where we eventually learn he confronts her and she says, like, I sold you. I still was the one that sold you into slavery as a minor. And so that was a cool reveal and sort of sets us up as having a good emotional core between these two characters, because clearly she's going to be a kind of a recurring, like, secondary villain throughout the show. And I like that there's a good, strong emotional connection between her, like Gwen has with the Diviner. So nice little setting up of some minor antagonists going on throughout this. And I love the trick that Dahl plays, that he places the comm badge onto the crystal, is able to steal it back. Absolutely clever. Shows Dahl progressing as a character, showing him that he's, like, now, like, normally I feel like Dahl, just a little while ago at the beginning of the series, probably would have been someone who would have just been like, yeah, fine, we can just steal this crystal, it's no big deal, who cares? But now has sort of developed a little bit more, so we're pushing forward his character in a really strong way, so that was great. And then I also just liked at the end, too, that we get some revelation with Hologram Janeway, that she's looking into the past, and we see that Deadlock was the one that attacked Chakotay back when the Protostar was initially crash landed. So this leads to some interesting stuff, because it appears that Deadlock was is the sort of second in command to the Diviner, but I'm here wondering if maybe Deadlock actually has a bit more power and is actually a bit more of the mastermind than we initially give him credit for. So some interesting sort of thoughts going into possibly where Deadlock sort of sits within the hierarchy and the larger mythology and backstory of the Protostar. And again, clearly some time travel shenanigans going on with the Protostar here, to have appeared so far in the past, back here in the Star Trek Prodigy, landing on that asteroid back at the beginning of the series. And then the final thing is, again, I also do really like that Janeway sort of calls the kids out and being like, you failed the Prime Directive, you screwed up, and you really affected this species' alien evolution. Sort of like showing that they failed to live up to Federation ideals. I feel like that was a good failure point for these characters to come across with. I wish we gotten to see a little bit more of the ramifications on the species, but, you know, given 24 minutes that this show has, I think that was absolutely fine. So overall, like I said, a strong episode, especially for Dahl, especially for building out the idea of the Prime Directive and pushing forward the mystery just a little bit. Nothing particularly revelatory there, but still good pushing forward. I think my biggest problems, and again, it might just be nitpicks on my part, but I don't feel like it is. I feel like it is just important details being missed in this show, but maybe you'll disagree with me. That I feel like is just a little bit frustrating. So overall, good episode, but just that little asterisk on it for me to really just prevent it from being great, in my opinion. But that's my thoughts on this episode of First Contact of Star Trek Prodigy. What did you think of it? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Let me know your comments on it. I also have a Patreon page to help support me doing what I do. You can subscribe to this channel for more reviews. I have a main channel, Jessie Gender, where I do my sort of analysis and bigger video essay stuff. But beyond all of that, I just thank you for being here. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.